A city wakes to a nightmare. On a cold January morning in 1947, Los Angeles woke to a nightmare it has never really escaped. In a vacant lot near the corner of 39th and Norton Avenue in Leimert Park, a mother pushing a stroller saw what she thought was a discarded store mannequin. It was not. It was the body of a young woman, her skin blanched and bloodless, her form arranged with such chilling deliberation that even hardened detectives would struggle to describe it in their reports. Within hours, the city's newest legend had a name one that would outshine movie marquees and drown out wartime headlines. The Black Dahlia. By noon, squad cars, photographers, and curiosity seekers crowded the curb. Uniformed officers roped off the patch of earth as detectives stepped carefully across the grass, tracing footprints, measuring distances, scanning faces. Onlookers cupped cigarettes, the smoke lifting into a pale winter sky, while rumors traveled faster than the police could verify them. A reporter scribbled in a notebook. A crime scene technician unsnapped a leather case. A detective lifted his gaze from the body to the line of houses across the street and imagined windows as eyes at anyone seeing the killer unload his secret in the night. The victim would soon be identified as Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, a Massachusetts native who had drifted west like so many others in the post-war tide, chasing sunlight, opportunity, and perhaps the faint glimmer of a studio call. But in that first hour, she was simply the mystery at the center of a meticulously staged tableau. The body had been cleaned. It had been bisected with eerie precision. There were no obvious pools of blood in the grass, hinting at a killing and dismemberment performed elsewhere, followed by a calculated delivery. Whoever did this wanted the discovery to be a spectacle. LAPD homicide, many veterans of wartime military police work fell into practiced roles. Establish perimeter, canvass the block, protect the scene from contamination. It was a losing battle. The press, emboldened by the unwritten truce that had long existed between reporters and police, edged close, then closer still. Photographers knelt, shutters snapping like insects. One detective barked, but the cameras kept clicking. In 1947, Los Angeles was a newspaper town, and newspapers had room for horror. By late afternoon, the precinct telephones were ringing. Tipsters, crackpots, neighbors with theories, all of them had something to say. The name Elizabeth Short began to move through the switchboards, followed by fragments of a life. A rented room, a friend's couch, a date that went nowhere, a missed phone call, a last sighting in a downtown lobby, a promise to write to someone she never would. Each scrap landed on a detective's desk, and each suggested a different story about who she had been and how she had ended up here. That night, the city sent out its usual music. Streetcars clanged. Radios murmured dance bands and ball scores. Neon warmed to life. But in apartments and diners, in studio bungalows and hotel lobbies, the conversation kept returning to the lot at 39th and Norton. Los Angeles had seen gang murders, extortion schemes, and Hollywood scandals. It had buried soldiers and welcomed the hopeful by the trainload. Yet this was different. The details clinical, theatrical, obscene, suggested an author who had studied fear and intended to publish it. Within 24 hours, the case had a nickname. Black Dahlia, a riff on a recent noir film, spread from newsroom wisecracks to front-page type. The moniker glued itself to the public mind with the speed and certainty of a brand. Names, after all, shape stories, and this story needed a name the city could whisper. Police weren't pleased, but it was too late. The case had been baptized by headline. In the squad room, the maps came out. The usual clockwise grind began. Last known movements, associates, alibis, travel times, transit lines, hospital supply lists, butcher shops, medical schools, studio prop departments, anywhere someone could acquire tools, privacy, knowledge. The detectives were competent, often brilliant in the ways working investigators are, dogged, skeptical, unromantic. But they were entering a game whose rules had been written by someone else. The killer had granted them a public stage and kept for himself the backstage where everything important had already happened. Rumor and theory grew like ivy. A jealous rage, a botched underground medical procedure, a sadist with surgical training, a stranger passing through. Each hypothesis offered just enough to feel right and never enough to close the file. The evidence was both abundant and evasive. Photographs, tire tracks, a heel print, the careful staging, the absence of blood. Meanwhile, leads exploded outward. The city suddenly a network of rooms, diners, bus depots, photo booths, and bars became a labyrinth in which the victim had left only partial footprints. What gripped Los Angeles was not simply the cruelty of the crime, but its composition. The act felt written. The display felt directed. And that resonance between horror and artifice, between brutality and arrangement made the case uniquely Californian. A murder in America's dream factory that understood the grammar of spectacle. Detectives recognized it, reporters amplified it, and the public consumed it. The lines between police work and performance blurred, not by choice but by design. By week's end, the city had learned a name, a face, a past in fragments, and a fear that felt new. The case would generate thousands of pages, dozens of suspects, and a mythology so adhesive that future writers would argue less about the facts than about the lenses through which to see them. But on that first day before the suspect lists and the grand theories, before the tips and the false confessions, before the letters and the archive of Black Dahlia, was a cold January morning, a mother with a stroller, a vacant lot, and a question that would come to define the case more than any answer. Who made this horror? And why did they want us to look? Hollywood on edge. In early 1947, Los Angeles was a city in flux. World War II had ended less than 2 years before, and the metropolis was swelling with returning servicemen, hopeful migrants, and the ever-expanding machinery of Hollywood. Neon signs lit up Sunset Boulevard, while the studios churned out films that promised glamour and escape. Yet beneath the bright facades and Art Deco marquees, the city harbored a darker reality. Corruption, organized crime, and a growing sense of unease that the dream factory could quickly turn into a nightmare. The discovery of Elizabeth Short's mutilated body collided with this atmosphere like a hammer blow. Hollywood had always thrived on stories of beauty and tragedy, but this was something different. This was not a carefully scripted melodrama, but a grotesque spectacle that seemed torn from the reels of a horror film. The details were too brutal, too theatrical, to be mistaken for anything but intentional design, and they landed in a city uniquely primed to absorb them. Los Angeles in the late 1940s was a city of contrasts. On one hand, it was the capital of aspiration, drawing thousands from the Midwest and East Coast with promises of sun, opportunity, and stardom. On the other, it was a city where many of those dreams soured. Cheap boarding houses overflowed with would-be actors and actresses who never made it past the casting call. War veterans found themselves adrift, struggling to translate combat experience into civilian jobs. The glamour of the silver screen was real, but it rested on a foundation of uncertainty, desperation, and transience. Into this context dropped the case that would become the Black Dahlia. The brutality of Elizabeth Short's murder did not just terrify, it resonated with broader anxieties. It reminded the public of the thin line between success and oblivion in Los Angeles. Here was a young woman, beautiful but struggling, caught between the promise of Hollywood and the reality of survival. Her end became a cautionary tale, a dark parable about the risks of chasing dreams in a city that fed on them. The newspapers seized on these themes immediately. They painted Elizabeth Short as both victim and enigma, a starlet in the making, a girl adrift in the city of angels, a mystery woman whose life was as fragmented as her death. In doing so, they connected her story to the larger mythology of Hollywood itself. the city that manufactured illusions had birthed its most gruesome one yet. The crime also struck at the fragile sense of order in post-war Los Angeles. The LAPD, already criticized for corruption and inefficiency, now found itself facing a case that demanded answers it could not easily provide. Detectives were flooded with tips, many of them contradictory or useless. Rumors spread like wildfire. Elizabeth Short was an actress, a call girl, a spy, a wanderer. The truth was simpler and more tragic, but the speculation reflected the city's own uncertainty about what it had become. Meanwhile, Hollywood itself reacted with a mixture of fascination and dread. Studio executives worried that the scandal might taint the industry, while gossip columnists recognized the irresistible pull of the story. The parallels to film noir were impossible to ignore. Audiences were already flocking to theaters to watch shadowy tales of betrayal, violence, and doomed women. Now, life seemed to imitate art in the most grotesque way. The Black Dahlia murder was not simply a crime, it was a noir script written in blood. For ordinary Angelenos, the case amplified an already growing fear of the city's darker corners. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone after dark. Boarding house landlords eyed tenants with suspicion. Taxi drivers swapped theories with patrons. The murder became a collective obsession, a lens through which anxieties about crime, corruption, and the fragility of safety were refracted. It was not just that a young woman had been killed. It was that her death seemed to say something larger about the city itself. The name Black Dahlia, coined by journalists eager for a catchy headline, sealed the case's place in the public imagination. Borrowed from a recent film noir titled The Blue Dahlia, the nickname gave the crime an aura of stylized mystery. It also reinforced the connection between Hollywood fiction and Los Angeles reality. The murder was no longer just a police investigation, it was a narrative, a brand, a phenomenon. And Hollywood, with its endless appetite for stories, was both implicated in and enthralled by it. In this way, the Black Dahlia murder was more than an isolated tragedy. It was a mirror held up to a city on the cusp of reinvention, a city where the glamour of the spotlight coexisted uneasily with the shadows at its edges. The case exposed how quickly hope could curdle into horror, how thin the membrane was between the dream and the nightmare. For Los Angeles, 1947 was not just the year of the Black Dahlia, it was the year Hollywood realized that its myths could be rewritten in flesh and blood. The girl behind the headline. Before the newspapers christened her the Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short was a young woman with a complicated, fragmented life story. To understand why her murder captured the imagination of Los Angeles and beyond, one must first understand the woman behind the headline. Elizabeth was born on July 29, 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters in the Short family. Her early years were marked by instability, particularly when her father abandoned the family during the Great Depression. The loss left her mother, Phoebe, to raise the girls alone, working multiple jobs to keep food on the table. Elizabeth grew up yearning for escape. Friends remembered her as striking pale skin, dark hair, a preference for stylish clothes. She wanted more than the limitations of her working-class upbringing could offer. In her teens, she suffered from respiratory issues and was sent to live in Florida for stretches of time to ease her health with warmer weather. It was there that she developed a love for palm trees, sunshine, and the glamorous images she saw in magazines and films. Hollywood became, in her imagination, the place where reinvention was possible. Her move to California was not a straight line, but rather a series of fits and starts. Elizabeth bounced between Massachusetts, Florida, and California during the war years. At one point, she worked in Vallejo at a military commissary, drawn by the energy of wartime America and the promise of connection with servicemen. Those who knew her then describe her as vivacious and flirtatious, someone who enjoyed attention and dreamed of cinematic success. But behind the charisma lay fragility. financial precarity, unstable housing, and a tendency to drift from one acquaintance to another. By the mid-1940s, Elizabeth had established herself in Los Angeles. She frequented bars, cafes, and theaters where actors and hangers-on mingled. She told friends she wanted to act, though she had no formal training. She sometimes hinted at screen tests or contacts in the industry, though these claims often blurred fact and fantasy. She cultivated an image dark hair styled in waves, striking makeup, and an aura of mystery that drew people in. Yet her lifestyle was unstable. She often depended on the kindness of acquaintances for a place to stay. She lacked steady employment. Her life was a patchwork of short-term arrangements and precarious dreams. This instability became central to the press portrayal of her after her death. Reporters, eager to sensationalize, painted Elizabeth in contradictory lights. As a would-be starlet, as a party girl, as a lonely drifter, even as a dangerous femme fatale. In reality, she was none of these in full, but fragments of each. Her story mirrored that of many young women drawn to Los Angeles in the 1940s showful, vulnerable, caught between aspiration and reality. Friends and acquaintances described Elizabeth as sweet-natured but somewhat secretive. She did not drink heavily, despite being a regular presence in nightlife circles. She was careful about her appearance, even when she had little money. She wrote frequent letters to her mother back in Massachusetts, though she often concealed the difficulties she faced in Los Angeles. In these letters, she painted a brighter picture than the reality she lived, perhaps out of pride, perhaps to shield her mother from worry. Elizabeth's last months were particularly rootless. She drifted between Hollywood, Long Beach, and San Diego, relying on acquaintances for shelter. She was romantically linked with several men, though none in a way that provided true stability. Her final confirmed sighting was at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, where she reportedly used the lobby phone before vanishing into the city night. Days later, she would be found in Leimert Park, the victim of one of the most infamous murders in American history. The portrait that emerges of Elizabeth Short is not one of a femme fatale or a starlet on the verge of fame, but of a young woman caught in the contradictions of post-war Los Angeles. She was ambitious yet insecure, glamorous in appearance but fragile in circumstance, independent in spirit but dependent on others for survival. In this way, she embodied both the allure and the peril of Hollywood in the 1940s. Her murder shocked the city not only because of its brutality, but because it seemed to confirm the darkest fears about what could happen to those who came west chasing dreams. For the public, Elizabeth became the Black Dahlia name, a symbol, a myth. But behind the sensational headlines was a real young woman navigating the challenges of youth, health, and ambition in a city that promised everything and delivered little. To reduce her to a nickname is to forget her humanity. To remember her fully is to see both the woman and the symbol she unwillingly became. The face of Hollywood's most gruesome mystery. 39th and Norton, Leimert Park. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a quiet neighborhood in Leimert Park became the stage for one of the most ghastly discoveries in American crime history. At around 10 a.m., a local housewife named Betty Berzinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter when she spotted what she thought was a broken mannequin discarded on a vacant lot near the corner of 39th Street and Norton Avenue. The figure lay in the grass, pale, segmented, and eerily posed. But as she approached, the horrifying truth revealed itself. It was no mannequin. It was the body of a young woman, mutilated with surgical precision and displayed in a way that seemed both deliberate and theatrical. Berzinger ran to the nearest house and called the police. Within minutes, squad cars and detectives converged on the scene. What they found would shock even seasoned investigators. The body had been bisected at the waist, drained of blood, and meticulously cleaned. There were no signs of struggle or blood at the site, suggesting the victim had been killed elsewhere and carefully transported to the lot. The killer had arranged her in a grotesque tableau, with arms raised above her head and legs spread apart, as though mocking both the victim and those who would find her. The first detectives on scene quickly called in reinforcements. Soon, the area swarmed with police, crime scene technicians, and reporters. Photographers captured images that would soon appear in newspapers across Los Angeles, searing the image of the crime scene into public consciousness. The juxtaposition of a quiet residential block with a macabre display only heightened the horror. It was as if Hollywood noir had spilled off the screen and onto the streets of Los Angeles. The condition of the body indicated a killer with both skill and composure. The bisection had been carried out with precision, leading investigators to speculate that the murderer had medical training or surgical experience. The victim's body was scrubbed clean, leaving little trace of forensic evidence. There were cuts on her face, including slashes from the corners of her mouth to her ear-sand infamous Glasgow smile that gave her corpse a grotesque, permanent grin. This mutilation suggested sadistic intent, turning the victim into an object of spectacle. Despite the brutality, certain details suggested careful planning rather than frenzied violence. The absence of blood at the scene meant the body had been drained elsewhere, perhaps in a private location with access to water and facilities. The transportation of the body to a residential lot showed confidence, even arrogance. The killer appeared to want the body to be found in exactly this way, as if staging a performance for the city. Neighbors crowded the sidewalks, staring in shock as police cordoned off the lot. Children whispered, adults pointed, and rumors began to fly. Some claimed they had seen a dark sedan the night before. Others insisted they heard nothing. The normal rhythms of a Los Angeles morning milk deliveries, bus rides, grocery shopping were eclipsed by the sight of a mutilated young woman left like refuse in the grass. The city's sense of safety fractured in an instant. As detectives worked, the press surged forward. In 1947, Los Angeles was a newspaper town, and the Black Dahlia story was a gift to editors hungry for sensation. Reporters clambered to the edges of the lot, shouting questions, snapping photos, and speculating aloud. The police tried to hold the line, but the boundaries between investigation and spectacle blurred almost immediately. It was a crime scene, but also a stage. The body was transported to the coroner's office, where the victim would soon be identified as Elizabeth Short. But on that morning, before the name was known, she was simply a horrifying mystery, a young woman transformed into a symbol of terror. For the residents of Leimert Park, the site would linger long after the crime scene tape was removed. For Los Angeles, it was the beginning of a story that would never fully end. The discovery at 39th and Norton was more than the uncovering of a murder victim. It was the unveiling of a narrative that combined brutality with performance, reality with theater. The killer had not only taken a life, but had delivered a message that horror could be staged in the heart of the city and that no one was safe from its reach. The crime scene was the prologue to a story that would grip Los Angeles and the nation for decades to come. Anatomy of a signature killing. The Black Dahlia crime scene remains one of the most studied and haunting in American history. Beyond the immediate horror of Elizabeth Short's mutilated body, investigators and criminologists have long dissected the details for clues about the killer's identity, psychology, and intent. Each cut, each arrangement, seemed to carry meaning, whether practical, sadistic, or symbolic. Elizabeth Short's body had been bisected at the waist, a surgical procedure known as a hemicorporectomy. This was not a crude hacking, but a clean, deliberate separation performed with anatomical knowledge. The cut had been made between the second and third lumbar vertebrae, a location that allowed the body to be divided without damaging bone. Forensics experts concluded that the killer possessed at least some familiarity with human anatomy, if not formal medical training. This detail became a cornerstone of early theories. Was the murderer a doctor, a surgeon, a butcher, or perhaps a wartime medic accustomed to trauma? The question has never been fully answered, but the precision set the crime apart from the chaotic violence typical of most homicides. The body had been completely drained of blood. This explained the absence of blood at the discovery site, but also raised questions about where and how the act had been performed. Bloodletting of this scale required time, equipment, and privacy. Some investigators speculated that the killer had access to a private residence with a bathtub or tiled floor where cleanup was manageable. Others suggested a medical or mortuary setting. Either way, the thoroughness of the process pointed to a killer who was both meticulous and unhurried. Equally chilling were the lacerations carved into Elizabeth's face. From the corners of her mouth, slashes extended upward toward her ears, creating a grotesque, permanent grin. This Glasgow smile was not necessary to kill, but was instead a deliberate act of mutilation. It transformed the victim into a spectacle, her face an emblem of sadism. Psychologists later interpreted this as a marker of deep-seated rage or a desire to dehumanize. It was as though the killer wanted to erase Elizabeth's identity and replace it with his own grim signature. The positioning of the body further underscored the theatricality of the crime. Elizabeth's arms were raised above her head, her legs spread apart, and her body posed in a way that suggested performance rather than concealment. Most killers seek to hide or discard their victims, but in this case, the body was displayed openly in a vacant lot, left to be found. The staging implied that the discovery itself was part of the killer's intention. He wanted the shock, the publicity, the fear that would ripple outward from the scene. Investigators also noted the condition of Elizabeth's skin. Her body appeared scrubbed clean, likely with a brush, removing fingerprints, dirt, and other trace evidence. This act of cleaning demonstrated both control and awareness of forensic procedures. In 1947, fingerprinting was already a cornerstone of police work, and the absence of such evidence suggested the killer had deliberately eliminated it. Yet the very act of scrubbing also added to the horror, further objectifying the victim as though she were a doll or mannequin. Additional injuries hinted at prolonged suffering. The coroner's report suggested that Elizabeth had endured a period of torture before death, though the exact duration and methods remained debated. Ligature marks on her wrists and ankles indicated she had been bound. Cuts and abrasions across her body suggested she had been beaten. Whether the mutilations were inflicted before or after death has remained a point of contention, but the possibility that she suffered through them only deepened the crime's cruelty. Beyond the body itself, the environment of the crime scene told its own story. The vacant lot was an unusual choice, open enough to ensure discovery, yet quiet enough at night to allow for the depositing of the body without witnesses. The killer likely scouted the location beforehand, choosing it for its combination of visibility and isolation. The fact that no one reported unusual activity in the hours before the discovery suggests the killer worked quickly and confidently, perhaps under cover of darkness. The crime scene became both a puzzle and a canvas. Detectives searched for footprints, tire tracks, and other signs of movement. They found impressions in the ground, but nothing conclusive. Neighbors recalled cars passing, but could not identify them. In the absence of clear physical evidence, the staging itself became the primary clue. The message seemed to be, this was not just murder, it was performance. For criminologists, the Black Dahlia crime scene remains a chilling example of what is sometimes called a signature killing. Unlike the modus operandi, which refers to the practical methods a killer uses, a signature reflects personal psychology's set of acts that fulfill emotional or symbolic needs. In Elizabeth Short's case, the surgical bisection, the facial mutilation, the scrubbing, and the posing all combined into a grotesque ritual. These elements were unnecessary for the killing itself, but essential to the killer's expression. In this way, the crime scene was less about concealment and more about communication. It broadcast a message of power, control, and contempt. It declared that the killer could operate undetected, that he could manipulate fear, and that he could turn a human life into an exhibition. For Los Angeles, the message landed with devastating clarity. The city was not simply facing a killer. It was confronting an author of horror whose work was still unfolding. LAPD under siege. The investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder began under a cloud of chaos and pressure that few police departments could have managed gracefully. For the Los Angeles Police Department, already battling a reputation for corruption and inefficiency, the Black Dahlia case quickly became both a test and a torment. The city was demanding answers, the press was circling like vultures, and the evidence seemed to dissolve as quickly as it was gathered. From the start, the scale of the case was overwhelming. More than 150 LAPD officers were assigned in the first days, joined by sheriff's deputies and even military police from local bases. Detectives canvassed entire neighborhoods, knocking on doors, questioning residents, searching vacant buildings, and checking local businesses for signs that might connect to the crime. Tips flooded in, ranging from sincere leads to crackpot theories. Every rumor, no matter how implausible, had to be followed up. The result was a sprawling investigation that spread resources thin. At Parker Center, the LAPD's headquarters, the squad room became a hive of frantic activity. Maps dotted with pins tracked Elizabeth Short's last known movements. Files piled high on desks, filled with statements from friends, acquaintances, and strangers who claimed to have seen her in the days before her death. The phone rang constantly, sometimes with useful information, more often with hoaxes or false confessions. In time, more than 60 people would confess to the Black Dahlia murder, none credibly. Detectives learned to filter desperation from fact, but it consumed valuable time. The coroner's office provided its grim report: death by hemorrhaging from lacerations combined with shock from the mutilations. The precision of the bisection fueled theories that the killer was a surgeon or someone with medical experience. Investigators visited hospitals, medical schools, and even dental clinics, searching for anyone with the requisite knowledge. They compiled lists of doctors, interns, and students, cross-checking them against criminal records. Yet no clear suspect emerged. Meanwhile, the press exerted enormous influence on the case. Newspapers competed fiercely for scoops, sometimes publishing details before detectives could verify them. The Herald Express and the Examiner splashed lurid headlines across their front pages, turning Elizabeth Short into both a victim and a spectacle. Journalists struck deals with police for access, sometimes even interviewing suspects before detectives could. The LAPD alternately relied on and resented the media, recognizing that coverage could generate tips but also distort the investigation. Public pressure mounted. Citizens demanded quick results, outraged that such a brutal killing could happen in their city without swift justice. City officials leaned on the police chief, who in turn pressed detectives to produce answers. The combination of political pressure and investigative deadends created a toxic environment inside the LAPD. Detectives clashed over theories. Some believed the killer was a stranger. Others insisted he must have known Elizabeth personally. Theories branched in every direction, with little evidence to prune them. The investigation was further hampered by lapses at the crime scene itself. The swarm of reporters, photographers, and onlookers had contaminated the lot before evidence could be properly secured. Footprints, tire tracks, and other traces were lost. In a case that already relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, these mistakes proved costly. The killer had displayed remarkable control and preparation, while the police struggled to maintain order in the aftermath. Despite these setbacks, detectives pursued dozens of leads. They tracked Elizabeth's movements to the Biltmore Hotel, where she was last seen alive, and traced her connections to men in Hollywood, Long Beach, and San Diego. They investigated servicemen, actors, drifters, and professionals alike. One by one, suspects were interrogated, alibis were checked, and promising leads collapsed. The investigation became less a straight path and more a maze, each corridor leading to another dead end. The LAPD's resources were stretched thin. Other homicides piled up, yet the Black Dahlia consumed the department's attention. Detectives worked long hours under immense scrutiny, their failures magnified by sensational headlines. The case became both an obsession and a curse. Solving it could redeem the department. Failure would confirm its critics. As weeks turned into months, the pressure did not ease. Instead, it calcified into frustration, and the murder of Elizabeth Short drifted toward legend even as the investigation remained officially active. In hindsight, the LAPD's struggle illustrates the limits of mid-20th century policing. Without modern forensic tools, detectives relied on legwork, informants, and intuition. Against an adversary who planned meticulously and left little evidence, those tools were blunt. The case would remain unsolved, a wound in the LAPD's history and a symbol of the city's darker truths. For the detectives of 1947, however, it was not yet legend but a daily grinda desperate search for a killer who seemed always a step ahead. Black Dahlia is born. If the brutality of Elizabeth Short's murder horrified Los Angeles, the press transformed that horror into a spectacle. In 1947, newspapers were the city's lifeblood, and competition among them was fierce. The Black Dahlia case arrived as a gift of story so lurid, so shocking, that editors knew it would sell papers in record numbers. And so began one of the most infamous media frenzies in American history. Within 24 hours of the discovery of Short's body, reporters from a Los Angeles Examiner and the Herald Express were filing sensational copy. Headlines screamed of mutilation, torture, and mystery. The Examiner, in particular, played a central role in shaping the narrative. Its reporters managed to obtain Elizabeth's personal details before the LAPD had even officially notified her mother. In a cruel twist, they called Phoebe Short in Boston, pretending that her daughter had won a beauty contest, only to extract biographical information before revealing the truth. Elizabeth had been murdered. From that moment, the story ceased to be just about a victim. It was about a character. The name Black Dahlia quickly took hold, borrowed from the film Where the Blue Dahlia and spiced with references to Elizabeth's dark hair and rumored wardrobe of black clothing. The nickname gave the case a brand, one that editors exploited relentlessly. It was mysterious, memorable, and marketable. Soon, the Black Dahlia was printed in bold type across newsstands from coast to coast. The press coverage blurred the line between journalism and entertainment. Newspapers published lurid photographs of the crime scene, heavily edited but still shocking. They splashed Elizabeth's glamour shots alongside grisly headlines, creating a jarring contrast between beauty and horror. Columns speculated endlessly about her lifestyle. Was she an aspiring actress? A drifter? A temptress? Reporters dug through her past, interviewing acquaintances and ex-boyfriends, often twisting quotes to fit the narrative of a doomed femme fatale. In doing so, the media both captivated and contaminated the public's understanding of the case. Elizabeth Short was no longer a young woman with dreams and struggles. She was the Black Dahlia, a symbol onto which readers could project their own fears and fantasies. The crime became a canvas for moral lessons about ambition, sexuality, and the dangers of the city. Every detail was exaggerated, every rumor amplified. Facts mattered less than the story's power to shock. The LAPD found itself in a double bind. On one hand, the publicity generated tips, keeping the case in the public eye and ensuring a steady flow of information. On the other, the sensationalism distorted leads and created immense pressure. False confessions multiplied as individuals sought their own moment of notoriety. Detectives often learn new facts about the case by reading the morning papers. The press was not just covering the story, it was steering it. The frenzy extended beyond Los Angeles. National and even international papers picked up the story, framing it as evidence of Hollywood's dark underbelly. To readers in small towns across America, the Black Dahlia murder confirmed suspicions that Los Angeles was a dangerous, decadent place where dreams curdled into nightmares. The city became both glamorous and grotesque, a stage on which the American imagination played out its anxieties about post-war life. In Hollywood itself, the case struck uncomfortably close to home. Actresses were warned not to travel alone at night. Studios issued careful statements distancing themselves from the murder while quietly monitoring press coverage. The parallels to film noir were inescapable. Elizabeth's story seemed to echo the doomed heroines of the screen, reinforcing the perception that life in Los Angeles was a dangerous script from which no one could deviate. As the weeks dragged on without an arrest, the media circus only intensified. Tabloids invented wild theories, linking the case to everything from organized crime to secret love affairs. Cartoonists drew grim caricatures. Columnists moralized about the dangers of fast living. The story metastasized into a cultural phenomenon, less about solving a crime than about feeding a collective obsession. For the family of Elizabeth Short, the coverage was devastating. Their daughter's memory was rewritten in headlines that oscillated between pity and condemnation. For the LAPD, the press was both ally and adversary, magnifying the case while eroding investigative control. For the city of Los Angeles, the Black Dahlia became a mirror reflecting not just a single murder, but a broader cultural hunger for spectacle. In this sense, the birth of the Black Dahlia was not just a media event. It was the creation of a modern myth. The name, the imagery, the endless speculation all transformed a brutal crime into a story that would never die. The victim had been erased and replaced with a legend, one that continues to haunt Los Angeles and fascinate the world. Taunts, cutouts, and a purse in the mail. As the Black Dahlia investigation stretched into weeks without resolution, the LAPD found itself taunted not only by the press, but by communications that seemed to come directly from the killer or at least someone desperate to play the part. The arrival of cryptic letters, cutout notes, and even mailed belongings transformed the case from a grim murder into a sinister correspondence, echoing the theatrics of other unsolved crimes like the later Zodiac killings. On January 24, 1947, a large envelope arrived at the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner. The package had been carefully addressed with cutout letters from magazines, a style that would become infamous in ransom notes and hoaxes for decades to come. Inside was a chilling collection: Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book with pages torn out. The killer, or impersonator, had also included a note. Here is Dahlia's belongings letter to follow. The handwriting was crude, the tone mocking. The items were undeniably real, confirming that whoever sent the package had direct access to Elizabeth's possessions. The mailing electrified the investigation. Detectives rushed the items to the crime lab, dusting for prints. They found several, but they had been obscured with an oily substance, as if deliberately smeared to prevent identification. This display of both confidence and control deepened the sense of a cat-and-mouse game. The killer, it seemed, was not content with murder alone. He wanted to dominate the narrative, to remind the public and the police that he was still out there, watching. In the days that followed, more letters arrived. Some were handwritten, others were composed of cut-out words and letters. Most carried mocking tones, ridiculing the police for their inability to solve the crime. One promised more killings if the murderer was not caught. Another suggested that the sender enjoyed the attention, boasting about the case's prominence in the press. Whether these letters were truly from the killer or from opportunistic hoaxers remains debated to this day. But at the time, Each communication was treated as potentially genuine. The most infamous note was signed the Black Dahlia Avenger. In it, the writer declared ownership of the crime and promised further revelations. Detectives compared the handwriting to samples from suspects, but no conclusive match was ever made. The note, like the package of belongings, seemed designed less to provide evidence than to cement the killer's mythology. By adopting a moniker, the sender echoed the theatrics of pulp fiction villains, aligning the crime with the noir fantasies already swirling in the public imagination. The LAPD was caught in a bind. Publishing the letters risked giving the killer exactly what he wanted: attention. Suppressing them risked losing potential leads. Ultimately, the press did print excerpts, fueling further public frenzy. Readers devoured the cryptic messages, speculating about their origins. Some believed the letters contained hidden codes. Others saw them as the ramblings of a deranged mind. Either way, the communications kept the Black Dahlia murder on front pages long after most crimes would have faded. The theatrics did not stop with letters. In February 1947, another envelope arrived containing a handbag and a black suede shoe believed to belong to Elizabeth Short. They were found discarded in a Los Angeles alley, again wiped clean with gasoline to remove prints. The recovery of these personal items reinforced the image of a killer who wanted to control every aspect of the story: the murder, the discovery, the aftermath, and even the victim's identity itself. For detectives, the letters and packages were both a torment and a clue. They suggested a killer who was organized, attention-seeking, and possibly motivated by a desire for infamy as much as by violence. At the same time, the inability to authenticate every communication created a hall of mirrors, where truth and hoax blurred together. Copycats may have joined the chorus, muddying the trail. The LAPD devoted countless hours to analyzing paper, ink, and handwriting, but the results yielded little more than frustration. In retrospect, the letters contributed as much to the legend of the Black Dahlia as the crime itself. They transformed Elizabeth Short's murder into an ongoing drama, a serialized story in which the killer or killers had speaking roles. They ensured that the case was never just about a victim and a suspect, but about an elusive phantom voice, mocking and provoking from the shadows. For the public, the letters were both terrifying and captivating. They suggested that the killer was still at large, capable of striking again, perhaps already planning his next move. For the LAPD, they were a reminder of failure, each envelope another taunt. And for history, they became artifacts of one of America's most gruesome, unsolved mysteries, objects that spoke not only of crime, but of theater, performance, and the enduring power of fear. Manley, Hansen, Dillon, and others. From the earliest days of the investigation, the LAPD knew that the Black Dahlia case would hinge on suspects. Dozens of men passed through their interrogation rooms in 1947, each one grilled for hours in the desperate hope of finding a crack that would lead to the killer. Over time, several names rose above the rest, figures whose connections to Elizabeth Short, or whose peculiar behavior, placed them at the center of suspicion. The first major suspect was Robert Red Manley, a 25-year-old salesman who had been one of the last people seen with Elizabeth before her disappearance. Manley had met Elizabeth in San Diego, where the two spent time together, though by his own account their relationship was not sexual. On January 8, 1947, Manley drove her from San Diego to Los Angeles, eventually dropping her off at the Biltmore Hotel. Witnesses confirmed this sighting, and Manley admitted to it during questioning. Because he was the last confirmed person to see her alive, suspicion naturally fell on him. Manley was subjected to intense interrogation. Detectives pressed him for inconsistencies in his story. He was given multiple polygraph tests, all of which he passed. He provided an alibi for the night of January 14th, supported by his wife and others. Despite lingering doubts, investigators eventually cleared him, concluding that while he may have been the last to see Elizabeth, he was not her killer. Still, Manley's name would remain linked to the case for years, a reminder of how easily proximity could turn a man into a suspect. Another figure who drew suspicion was Mark Hansen, a wealthy nightclub owner with Hollywood connections. Hansen was known for providing housing to young women aspiring to break into show business, and Elizabeth had reportedly stayed at his home for a time. Some accounts suggested that Hansen had made advances toward her, which she rebuffed. His name appeared in Elizabeth's address book, which was mailed to the Examiner in the taunting package sent by the killer. This connection placed him squarely in the sights of investigators. Hansen was questioned extensively, but like Manley, he was never charged. Those who knew him described him as charming but manipulative, a man accustomed to control. While rumors circulated that he might have been involved in Elizabeth's death, no physical evidence tied him to the crime. Still, Hansen's wealth, influence, and reputation for keeping company with vulnerable young women made him a perennial figure in Black Dahlia theories. Joseph A. Dillon, a Hollywood attorney, also emerged as a suspect. Dillon was known for his unsavory relationships with young women, some of whom he reportedly exploited. Elizabeth was said to have been among those he supported financially, raising questions about the nature of their association. Dillon's reputation as a manipulator and abuser of women made him a plausible suspect in the eyes of detectives, though again, evidence was circumstantial. Like Hansen, he represented the shadowy side of Hollywood, where power imbalances created opportunities for exploitation. Beyond these men, dozens of others cycled through the LAPD's files. Some were actors, others drifters, some medical professionals whose skills seemed to align with the surgical precision of the crime. More than 60 people confessed to the murder, though all were eventually dismissed as false or attention-seeking. The sheer volume of suspects reflected both the desperation of the investigation and the allure of the case to unstable individuals eager for notoriety. In time, one suspect would rise above the others in the public imagination. Dr. George Hodel, a Los Angeles physician with a reputation for brilliance, arrogance, and disturbing behavior. Though Hodel was not seriously pursued in 1947, later investigations, particularly those led by his own son, LAPD Detective Steve Hodel, would thrust him into the center of theories about the Black Dahlia murder. His medical expertise, access to facilities, and documented abuse of women made him a compelling candidate. But in 1947, Hodel was just one of many names in a crowded suspect pool. The failure to secure a prime suspect underscored the limitations of the investigation. Without modern forensic tools, detectives relied on alibis, witness statements, and circumstantial connections. Men like Manley, Hansen, and Dillon fit pieces of the puzzle, but never locked into place. Each was plausible, none provable. The killer, whoever he was, remained a phantom, always just out of reach. For the public, the parade of suspects became part of the story's fascination. Each new name promised resolution, only to dissolve into uncertainty. For detectives, it was a treadmill of interviews, interrogations, and disappointments. The deeper they dug, the more the case seemed to expand, until it threatened to engulf the entire city. The prime suspects of 1947, Manley, Hansen, Dillon, and countless others were less definitive answers than reflections of Los Angeles itself, a city of ambition, corruption, glamour, and menace. Each man embodied a different facet of the Black Dahlia myth, but none provided the closure the city craved. In the absence of a conviction, suspicion itself became the legacy, a shadow that lingered long after the interrogations ended. Surgical skill and Dr. George Hodel. Among the many theories that emerged during the Black Dahlia investigation, few carried as much weight or as much lasting intrigue as the suspicion that Elizabeth Short's killer possessed surgical training. From the moment the coroner examined her bisected body, Detectives recognized that this was no ordinary crime. The clean division of the torso, the drainage of blood, and the absence of botched cuts pointed to someone with anatomical knowledge and steady hands. The question naturally followed: was the killer a doctor? Throughout 1947, the LAPD investigated numerous medical professionals in Los Angeles. Surgeons, general practitioners, and even medical students were interviewed. Hospitals and universities were asked to account for their staff. Detectives compiled lists of physicians with a history of violence or scandal. But one name, years later, would eclipse all others: Dr. George Hill Hodel. Hodel was a physician and well-connected figure in Los Angeles high society. Brilliant but arrogant, he cultivated an aura of sophistication. He lived in the famous Soden House, a striking Mayan revival mansion designed by Lloyd Wright, which later investigators would suggest could have served as the private setting for Elizabeth Short's torture and dismemberment. Hodel's reputation was already marred by scandal. In 1949, he was tried though acquitted for the sexual abuse of his daughter, Tamar. The case revealed disturbing glimpses of his private life: orgiastic parties, cruelty, and a fascination with control. To some, these details seem to align chillingly with the Black Dahlia crime. At the time of the murder, however, Hodel was not seriously pursued. He was one of many doctors briefly considered, but no solid evidence tied him to the crime. That changed decades later when his son, Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD homicide detective, began his own investigation. Steve uncovered connections that cast his father in a sinister light: medical training, proximity to Elizabeth Short, a house that could have concealed the crime, and even alleged references in George Hodel's personal papers. One of the most compelling pieces of circumstantial evidence was an overheard conversation. In 1950, during a separate investigation into Hodel, the LAPD wiretapped his home. On the recordings, Hodel was allegedly heard saying, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now." Though cryptic and perhaps boastful, the remark became a key pillar of later suspicions. Combined with his history of abuse and his evident narcissism, it painted a portrait of a man who could plausibly have orchestrated one of the century's most notorious murders. Skeptics caution, however, that the evidence remains circumstantial. Hodel was never charged, and contemporaneous investigators in 1947 did not prioritize him over other suspects. Much of the case against him was built decades later, filtered through his son's determined but inevitably subjective lens. Critics argue that Steve Hodel's theory relies on connecting dots that may not have been intended to align. Enthusiasts counter that the sheer accumulation of troubling details is too much to ignore. The doctor theory extended beyond Hodel. Investigators also explored connections to medical schools, considering whether a student or intern might have performed the bisection. Others speculated about butchers or morticians. The surgical skill implied by the cuts became a paradox, precise enough to suggest training, but not so refined as to prove professional expertise. Could an amateur with anatomical books and wartime experience have done the same? The ambiguity left detectives grappling with possibilities rather than conclusions. Dr. Hodel's story, however, endured. In part, this was due to the allure of his persona. The wealthy, cultured physician living in a sinister mansion, dabbling in avant-garde art and shadowy practices. His connections to surrealist circles, including artists fascinated by themes of mutilation and female form, only deepened the aura of menace. To a public already conditioned by noir fiction, Hodel seemed less like a suspect than a character drawn directly from its pages. By the early 2000s, Steve Hodel's books had cemented his father's place at the center of Black Dahlia lore. Television documentaries and true crime podcasts amplified the theory, making George Hodel a household name among those fascinated by unsolved mysteries. While the debate continues, The doctor theory remains one of the most compelling narratives in the entire case. It combines the chilling technicalities of the crime with the psychological horror of a man whose private life seemed to echo the depravity of the murder. Ultimately, the focus on doctors reflects more than just the details of Elizabeth Short's mutilation. It reflects the public's need for an explanation that matches the crime's theatricality and precision. To believe that her killer was a doctor is to impose order on chaos. To imagine that skill and training, however corrupted, could account for such horror. Whether or not George Hodel or any physician was truly responsible, the suspicion endures, a dark prescription written into the mythology of the Black Dahlia. LA's 1940s homicide landscape. As the Black Dahlia investigation sprawled into the late 1940s, it became clear that the case did not exist in a vacuum. Los Angeles at the time was a city both glittering and grim, with violent crime woven into its fabric. The post-war years brought not only an influx of migrants, but also an undercurrent of instability in employment, displacement, and trauma carried home from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. Against this backdrop, Elizabeth Short's murder was both singular and emblematic, a headline crime in a city already haunted by violence. One complicating factor for detectives was the wave of copycat crimes and hoaxes that followed the Black Dahlia's discovery. The sheer notoriety of the case inspired pranksters, opportunists, and disturbed individuals to insert themselves into the narrative. Some sent letters mimicking the taunting tone of the so-called Black Dahlia Avenger. Others phoned in bogus tips or claimed to have information about Elizabeth's final days. Each new lead had to be pursued, stretching the LAPD's resources thinner and blurring the line between fact and fabrication. At the same time, Los Angeles was experiencing a surge in violent crime that complicated the picture. In 1946 alone, the city recorded more than 100 homicides. Many of these went unsolved, either due to lack of evidence or because the LAPD was overwhelmed. Women, in particular, were vulnerable. The influx of young women seeking careers in Hollywood created opportunities for exploitation. Boarding houses and cheap hotels teemed with transplants, many without strong support networks. Predators thrived in this environment, and Elizabeth Short's murder seemed to crystallize those fears. In the months following the Black Dahlia case, several murders of women in Los Angeles bore superficial similarities. Some victims were young, transient, or associated with nightlife. A few were mutilated, though never with the surgical precision seen in Short's case. Detectives investigated links, but found little evidence to connect them. Nevertheless, the press eagerly speculated about a serial killer, feeding public paranoia. For Angelenos, every unsolved murder became a potential Dahlia sequel. The climate of fear extended beyond Los Angeles. Across the United States, headlines invoked the Black Dahlia whenever a woman was found murdered under mysterious circumstances. Cases in Chicago, San Francisco, and even as far away as Florida were compared to Short's killing, regardless of actual connection. The Dahlia became shorthand for unsolved female homicides, her name a symbol of the era's anxieties about sexuality, independence, and violence. The LAPD's handling of the case also reflected broader problems in the department. Corruption was rampant, with officers often beholden to political patrons or organized crime figures. Some historians argue that these dynamics hindered the investigation, as resources were diverted or leads were mishandled. Others point to sheer overextension. The Black Dahlia case was one of many high-profile murders vying for attention in a city where homicide had become almost routine. Copycats and hoaxes only magnified these issues. Detectives wasted hundreds of hours chasing false leads. In one instance, a man walked into a police station claiming to be the killer, only to recant under questioning. In another, pranksters sent letters written in blood-red ink, later revealed to be nothing more than theatrical hoaxes. Each incident eroded public confidence, making the LAPD appear inept even when the fault lay with outsiders. Cultural context added yet another layer. The 1940s were the golden age of film noir, a genre steeped in cynicism, crime, and fatalism. Movies like Double Indemnity and The Blue Dahlia reflected and reinforced a worldview in which women were often portrayed as both victims and dangerous seductresses. Elizabeth Short's story slotted easily into this narrative, whether or not it reflected her true character. For the public, she was less a person than an archetype, the doomed young woman in a city of shadows. This blending of fiction and reality contributed to the sense that the Black Dahlia case was larger than life. Copycats saw themselves as players in a noir drama. Reporters wrote as though scripting a screenplay. Detectives, whether they admitted it or not, felt the pressure of performing not only for justice but for an audience. The murder was not just a crime. It was a cultural event, endlessly replayed and refracted through the anxieties of its time. In retrospect, the presence of copycats and the broader landscape of 1940s crime helps explain why the case remains unsolved. Investigators were not only hunting a killer, but navigating a hall of mirrors filled with imitators, hoaxes, and distractions. The Black Dahlia became both one murder and many singular act of brutality and a template for countless others imagined, fabricated, or misattributed. By the close of the decade, Los Angeles had settled uneasily into its reputation as both dream factory and crime capital. Elizabeth Short's death was not the city's only unsolved mystery, but it was the one that seemed to capture its essence. The Black Dahlia was not just a victim, but a phenomenon, her murder reflecting the violence of her era while transcending it, becoming legend. What science could not do. In 1947, the field of forensic science was far from the sophisticated discipline it would later become. The Black Dahlia case, with its gruesome details and paucity of solid leads, highlighted both the capabilities and the severe limitations of mid-20th century crime scene investigation. For detectives and coroners, Elizabeth Short's murder was not only a test of their investigative skill, but also of the tools science could provide and, often, what it could not. The autopsy conducted on Elizabeth Short revealed several key facts. The cause of death was determined to be hemorrhaging and shock from the facial lacerations, combined with trauma inflicted before and after death. The bisection of the body was performed with precision, confirming suspicions of anatomical knowledge. Ligature marks showed that Short had been bound, and abrasions suggested she had been beaten. Yet while the coroner could document these findings, they could not point to a specific suspect. Forensic medicine at the time was skilled at describing wounds, but limited in its ability to translate them into actionable leads. Fingerprints, one of the strongest tools available, were of little help. The killer had scrubbed Elizabeth's body clean, erasing surface evidence. Items mailed to the examiner, such as her address book and personal effects, were similarly wiped with gasoline, smearing or destroying prints. Investigators did recover partial prints from envelopes, but they were smudged beyond utility. Without the digital databases available today, even a clean fingerprint match required physical comparison against thousands of index cards, a monumental task with slim chances of success. Blood analysis offered little more. Typing could determine a victim's blood group, but DNA testing was still decades away. Hair and fiber analysis existed, but was rudimentary, often relying on microscopic comparison rather than the advanced techniques of later forensic science. Soil samples from the crime scene were collected, but contamination by crowds of reporters and onlookers rendered them unreliable. One forensic avenue that detectives pursued was handwriting analysis of the taunting letters. Experts attempted to compare the Black Dahlia Avenger notes with samples from suspects like Mark Hansen and others. But handwriting analysis in the 1940s was as much art as science, often subjective and prone to error. No definitive link could be established. The letters remained haunting artifacts rather than evidence that could hold up in court. The LAPD also lacked centralized coordination of forensic evidence. Each division handled its own cases, often with limited communication between labs, detectives, and outside experts. The result was duplication of effort and occasional loss of material. In an age before computerized record-keeping, evidence could simply be misplaced or buried under the sheer volume of paperwork generated by the case. Fast forward to the modern era, and the contrast is stark. Advances in DNA analysis, digital databases, and forensic imaging have revolutionized criminal investigation. Cold case units across the country have solved decades-old murders with a single hair follicle or a trace of saliva on an envelope. In theory, the Black Dahlia case could benefit from these techniques. Some of Elizabeth Short's belongings, preserved in archives, have reportedly been re-examined with modern methods. But the passage of time has degraded much of the evidence. Biological samples may no longer yield viable DNA. Chain of custody issues further complicate the matter, as evidence moved between departments and stored facilities over the decades. Still, modern science offers tantalizing possibilities. Familial DNA matching, used to capture the Golden State Killer in 2018, could potentially identify the Black Dahlia's murderer if any preserved material can yield results. Advances in geospatial analysis, digital fingerprint enhancement, and even AI-assisted crime scene reconstruction could provide new insights. But each depends on the survival and integrity of evidence collected in 1947, evidence that was compromised from the very beginning. The forensic limitations of the time underscore why the case has endured as a mystery. Detectives worked tirelessly, but they were constrained by tools that could document horror without decoding it. Modern science tempts us with the hope that a breakthrough is still possible, but it also reminds us of how much was lost in those chaotic early days. The vacant lot at 39th and Norton was trampled by police, press, and public alike, and with each footprint, the chances of clarity faded. For the Black Dahlia case, forensic science was both ally and betrayer. It revealed the extraordinary brutality of the crime, but it could not point to a face, a name, or a conviction. Today, the case stands as both a monument to investigative determination and a cautionary tale about the limits of science in the absence of preservation and order. It is a reminder that even the sharpest scalpel cannot cut through time. Noir, films, books, myth-making. The Black Dahlia murder was not only a crime, it was a story that embedded itself in the cultural imagination of Los Angeles and, eventually, the world. In the decades following Elizabeth Short's death, her case transcended police files and entered the realm of literature, film, and myth, becoming a defining part of American true crime lore. The timing of the case played a significant role in shaping its cultural impact. The late 1940s were the golden age of film noir, a genre obsessed with shadows, moral ambiguity, and the dark undercurrents of urban life. Audiences were already primed to see the world through noir's lens, a place where innocence collided with corruption, where beauty hid danger, and where violence lurked just out of sight. The Black Dahlia case fit perfectly into this narrative framework. It was, in essence, real-life noir. Writers seized on the case almost immediately. Newspapers published not only news stories, but serialized features that played up the drama of Elizabeth Short's life and death. In the years that followed, pulp magazines fictionalized her story, often exaggerating her supposed promiscuity or portraying her as a tragic starlet destroyed by Hollywood's cruelty. The truth of her Lithia, young woman adrift, fragile but hopeful, was often lost beneath layers of lurid embellishment. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Black Dahlia had become a staple reference point in crime writing. True crime anthologies included her case alongside those of Jack the Ripper and other notorious unsolved murders. For authors, the lack of resolution made the story endlessly compelling. Each retelling could emphasize different suspects, different motives, or different symbolic interpretations. The absence of closure allowed the myth to grow. One of the most influential treatments came in 1987, when novelist James Ellroy published The Black Dahlia, a fictionalized account that blended fact with invention. Ellroy, whose own mother had been murdered when he was a child, channeled his obsession with the case into a sprawling noir narrative. The novel was a bestseller, praised for its style and atmosphere, though criticized by some for exploiting Elizabeth Short's memory. In 2006, Brian De Palma adapted the book into a film, further cementing the case's place in Hollywood's cultural landscape. Beyond fiction, the case inspired countless documentaries and true crime explorations. Television specials revisited the evidence, often highlighting the George Hodel theory or showcasing interviews with surviving investigators. Podcasts in the 21st century reignited interest, introducing a new generation to the mystery. Each medium refracted the story through its own lens, ensuring that the Black Dahlia remained part of the cultural conversation. Elizabeth Short's image also became iconic in its own unsettling way. Photographs of her, particularly her glamorous studio portraits, were reproduced endlessly, juxtaposed against grisly descriptions of her death. This contrast, the beautiful young woman and the horrific crime, became the defining tension of the case in popular memory. She was both a victim and an archetype, a symbol of innocence corrupted by the city of dreams. Artists and musicians also drew inspiration from the case. The surreal and grotesque aspects of the murder resonated with avant-garde sensibilities. Bands referenced the Black Dahlia in lyrics and album art. Painters and photographers used her likeness to explore themes of violence, femininity, and spectacle. Over time, the case became less about Elizabeth Short as a person and more about what she represented: the intersection of beauty, horror, and myth. Critics have long debated whether this cultural echo amounts to remembrance or exploitation. On one hand, the enduring fascination keeps Elizabeth Short's name alive, ensuring that she is not forgotten. On the other, the constant fictionalization risks erasing her humanity, turning her into a character rather than a victim. The line between tribute and objectification is thin, and the Black Dahlia case walks it uneasily. Yet perhaps it is this very tension that explains the story's longevity. The Black Dahlia murder sits at the crossroads of history and myth, fact and fiction, crime and culture. It is endlessly adaptable, able to serve as cautionary tale, noir parable, feminist critique, or simple mystery, depending on the teller. Like Los Angeles itself, it resists singular definition. In the end, the cultural echo of the Black Dahlia is not only about one young woman's death, but about the stories we tell around violence, the myths we create to make sense of the senseless. Elizabeth Short may have been silenced in 1947, but the narrative that followed ensured that her voice distorted, refracted, mythologized will never fade from American memory. Why it remains unsolved: politics, police, and time. More than 75 years after Elizabeth Short's murder, the Black Dahlia case remains officially unsolved. Despite thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of suspects, and endless public fascination, no one has ever been formally charged. The reasons for this are complex, rooted not only in the cunning of the killer, but also in the limitations of the investigation, the politics of Los Angeles, and the slow erosion of time. One of the central obstacles was the state of the LAPD in 1947. The department was under immense pressure to deliver results, but it was also plagued by corruption and inefficiency. Officers were often beholden to political patrons or entangled with organized crime. Some historians argue that promising leads in the Black Dahlia case may have been deliberately ignored or suppressed to to protect influential figures. Others point to simple incompetence. Crime scenes contaminated, evidence misplaced, suspects mishandled. In a case that demanded precision, the department delivered chaos. The sheer volume of information also hindered progress. With so many tips, hoaxes, and false confessions, detectives struggled to separate signal from noise. Every new letter, every phone call, every rumor had to be logged and pursued. The result was investigative paralysis. While detectives ran down dead-end leads, the true killer, if he was ever even among the suspects, slipped further into the shadows. Political considerations compounded these difficulties. City leaders were acutely aware of how the murder reflected on Los Angeles itself. The city was trying to project an image of progress and glamour in the booming post-war years. The Black Dahlia threatened that image, casting Los Angeles as a city of danger and decay. Pressure from above may have led to hasty decisions, public misdirection, or even intentional obfuscation. Some researchers argue that the LAPD was less interested in solving the case than in containing it, preventing further damage to the city's reputation. Time itself has proven to be the greatest enemy of resolution. As decades passed, evidence was lost, degraded, or contaminated. Witnesses died, memories faded, and suspects passed away. Each passing year closed more doors than it opened. Even when modern forensic science emerged offering tools like DNA, testing a chain of custody issues made it nearly impossible to rely on what little evidence remained. The possibility of a conclusive forensic breakthrough is slim, though not entirely impossible. The case has also been hindered by its own mythology. The Black Dahlia became larger than life, a cultural phenomenon that overshadowed the woman at its center. With each new book, film, or documentary, speculation multiplied. Theories ranged from credible to absurd, from lone sadists to vast conspiracies involving Hollywood elites or corrupt officials. While some of these theories generated new leads, most only added to the fog, obscuring rather than illuminating the truth. Another factor is the possibility that the killer was simply never on the LAPD's radar in any meaningful way. Los Angeles was a vast, sprawling city, full of transients, servicemen, and drifters. It is entirely possible that the perpetrator committed the crime and vanished, leaving behind no ties to Elizabeth Short beyond that fatal encounter. If so, the case was doomed from the start. For all these reasons, the Black Dahlia remains unsolved. But perhaps part of its enduring power lies precisely in that absence of closure. An unsolved case invites endless speculation, allowing each generation to project its own fears and fascinations onto the mystery. It becomes not just a historical event, but a mirror for cultural anxieties, from the corruption of institutions to the vulnerability of women in a predatory city. To ask why the case remains unsolved is to confront not just the failings of the police department, but the nature of mystery itself. Some crimes resist resolution not because the answers are unknowable, but because they are buried under layers of human error, competing interests, and time's relentless march. The Black Dahlia may be one of those cases of crime whose true story is forever fractured, scattered across rumor, report, and imagination. And so the murder of Elizabeth Short remains what it has always been, a riddle without an answer, a tragedy without justice, and a legend that refuses to die. The face in the archive and unanswered questions. The Black Dahlia murder endures as one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in American history. More than 3/4 of a century after Elizabeth Short's body was discovered in Leimert Park, her story continues to captivate, horrify, and provoke. The persistence of the case in public memory speaks not only to the brutality of the crime itself, but to the layers of meaning that have accumulated around it, layers of myth, speculation, and cultural fascination. Elizabeth Short's legacy is paradoxical. In life, She was a young woman chasing possibilities, moving from city to city, seeking connection, stability, and perhaps stardom. In death, she became the Black Dahlia, a symbol both of vulnerability and of menace, a canvas onto which society projected its fears about women, sexuality, and ambition in post-war America. The nickname, coined by the press, eclipsed her identity, yet it also ensured that she would never be forgotten. To this day, her image-glamorous studio portraits juxtaposed against grim headlines remains iconic. The unanswered questions are many. Who killed Elizabeth Short? Was it someone she knew, or a stranger who crossed her path at the worst possible moment? Was the surgical precision of her mutilation the work of a doctor like George Hodel, or could a less formally trained hand have produced it? Were the taunting letters truly from her killer, or the work of opportunists drawn into the case's orbit? Each question invites theories, but none yields certainty. The case also raises broader issues about justice and memory. The LAPD's failings in 1947 remind us of how institutions can stumble under pressure, and how corruption or incompetence can warp the pursuit of truth. At the same time, the endurance of the Black Dahlia in popular culture shows how crime can transform into narrative, how a single murder can echo for decades through books, films, and art. In this sense, Elizabeth Short's death was not just a private tragedy, but a public parable, a cautionary tale about the costs of dreams and the dangers of spectacle. For historians and true crime enthusiasts, the Black Dahlia remains a puzzle with just enough pieces to tantalize, but never enough to complete. The surviving evidence is fragmented, the suspects long dead, the witnesses gone. Modern forensic science offers slim hope, but time is the greatest enemy. The odds of a definitive resolution shrink with every passing year. Yet the possibility, however faint, that DNA testing or archival discovery might one day crack the case keeps the mystery alive. For the city of Los Angeles, the case is part of its DNA. It embodies the contradictions of a city that sells dreams but often delivers disillusionment. It reflects the noir sensibility that has long defined Los Angeles in the popular imagination, a place of light and shadow, of glamour and corruption, of beauty and death. The Black Dahlia is inseparable from the mythology of the city itself. And for Elizabeth Short's family, the case is a wound that never healed. Her mother, Phoebe, endured the cruelty of learning of her daughter's death through a reporter's deception. Her sisters lived in the shadow of the case, their grief compounded by the sensationalism that surrounded Elizabeth's memory. To remember Elizabeth solely as the Black Dahlia is to forget the pain of those who loved her and lost her. Perhaps that is the ultimate legacy, the tension between the person and the myth between Elizabeth Short and the Black Dahlia. We may never know the truth of who killed her or why, but we know that she was more than the headlines, more than the sensationalism. She was a daughter, a sister, a young woman whose life was cut short in a way so brutal that it demanded the world's attention. In remembering her, we confront not only the darkness of her murder, but also the forces media, culture, society had shaped her into a legend. The Black Dahlia murder remains unsolved, and perhaps it always will. But the story endures, not only as a crime, but as a mirror. It reflects our fascination with mystery, our fear of violence, our hunger for narrative. It forces us to ask why we are drawn to such horrors, and what it says about us that we keep telling and retelling the tale. In the end, Elizabeth Short's legacy is not just in the unanswered questions, but in the persistence of those questions. They ensure that she is remembered, that her story is told, and that the mystery of the Black Dahlia will never truly fade.